coronation of Queen Elizabeth II took place on the 2nd of June 1953. It was a lavish affair. Westminster Abbey had been closed for months as preparations took place, and on the day itself, millions thronged the streets of London.
Westminster Abbey was transformed practically into a theatre, if you like, with galleries packed with 8,000 people.
The coronation was to be an end to austerity. It was to inaugurate as the new Elizabethan age.
It was designed really to reaffirm Britain's status in a post-war world which had been turned upside down. A very glamorous young queen was there to optimistically lead the British people into the future.
I do remember Coronation Day quite well because my father had tickets for some seats near Admiralty Arch through the army. He was in the army. And I remember sitting there and seeing the guests and their carriages coming towards Admiralty Arch, where Churchill came along. And I remember opposite us, his furious face sticking out of the window, glaring at the traffic jam in front of the arch.
The coronation itself was the same ancient ceremony, unchanged for centuries. But there was at least one touch of modernity. It was the first to be televised. Not that many ordinary people owned televisions. Britain was still mired in post-war austerity. Some goods were still rationed 8 years after the defeat of Germany. And on the international stage, Britain was declining as an imperial and military power. Nevertheless, the nation celebrated. Yet behind the pomp and glamour of that day lay family grief, disputes and scandals just waiting to explode. In the middle of preparations for the coronation, Margaret stunned Elizabeth by informing her that she wished to marry. Her desired husband was a man named Peter Townsend. He had been a wartime flying ace and had flown more than 500 missions and been shot down twice in the process.
During the war, George VI decided that he would honor servicemen who distinguished themselves and would have them as a query for periods of 3 months. Recommended was the much decorated RAF fighter pilot, Group Captain Peter Townsend. Townsend and the King got on so well together. It is said the King referred to him as the son I never had, that the idea of a 3-month period in waiting as a query just went straight out of the window.
After the King's death in 1952, Townsend's job disappeared, but the family did not wish to lose him. He was invited to join the Queen Mother's household as controller, a role he accepted.
All the girls at Buckingham Palace and all the girls that were around the court rather took a fancy, took a shine to this guy. But the one who really fell in love with him was Princess Margaret.
You can understand, perhaps, at that moment, having lost her father, she turned more to him than was perhaps advisable.
He was there when her father died. Part of the inner circle of royal aides and servants who helped to comfort Margaret. After all, Margaret was devastated by her father's loss. This was a man who'd been close to, who'd been liked by her father. He was also, like her brother-in-law, a hero, and people liked heroes. It was still an age when we built heroes up.
Townsend was 16 years older than Margaret and recently divorced. While these facts did not trouble Margaret, others were less happy.
Well, there was opposition to the relationship for one simple reason, that he was already married, and he had a wife and he had 2 boys.
Divorced people not really allowed to have a social life. And I think that sadly, that was what happened. He was quite a bit older than her, but I don't think that would have mattered.
Under a law of 1772, all members of the royal family had to have the sovereign's permission to marry. Elizabeth was sympathetic. She could see the love between the couple, but she asked Margaret to wait until the coronation was out of the way and everything had settled down. Margaret left the meeting with her sister feeling hopeful. But when Elizabeth spoke to her private secretary, Sir Alan Lascelles, he was horrified and urged Elizabeth to send Townsend abroad. Elizabeth was caught between love for her sister and her responsibilities to the legal and religious bodies she headed.
She loved Margaret and she wanted her to be happy. I think it was incredibly difficult for her.
All of politicians, with some exceptions, including Winston Churchill, were advising her that this marriage should not go ahead. And as such a new monarch, she didn't want to risk the potential friction for really putting up strong opposition against what the political classes were telling her. In other words, she put duty before her own private feelings.
The Queen is temporal governor of the Church of England, and the Church of England did not, would not recognise divorce.
She agreed to send Townsend abroad. He was appointed heir attaché in Brussels. Townsend was stunned by this exile. He did not even get a chance to say goodbye to Margaret, who was on a royal tour in Africa at the time. Margaret was left bitter. Her own sister was queen but could not help her. In Brussels, Townsend was hounded by the press. They maintained a constant correspondence. The couple believed they had only to wait.
It was also obviously part of the plan that if Margaret and Townsend had to wait 2 years, it was pushing the princess closer to her 25th birthday. And the importance of that was that at 25, a member of the royal family could petition Parliament for permission to marry. And if both houses didn't oppose it, then they could have a civil marriage. And that was, I think, what was happening here. Margaret was going to be 25 in August of 1955.
As the press counted down to the date, speculation grew that an engagement announcement was imminent. But her birthday came and went with no announcement. Finally, on the 31st of October 1955, Margaret released a statement to the press. Her relationship with Townsend was over, it said. There would be no marriage.
The decision not to marry Group Captain Peter Townsend is reached by Britain's Princess Margaret, here arriving with her mother for a formal family appearance at London's Royal Opera House. In putting duty and religion ahead of her heart, Margaret had the example of her sister, the Queen, who dutifully entertained the President of Portugal while the family crisis neared a climax. Queen Mother Elizabeth approved her daughter's decision. Strongly opposing the marriage was the Archbishop of Canterbury.
The traditional interpretation has always been that the Prime Minister and ecclesiastical figures really threatened Margaret with the withdrawal of her royal allowances and her HRH if her marriage with Peter Townsend went ahead.
The government of the day, under the premiership of Anthony Eden, had actually done something of a U-turn. Far from opposing the marriage, they had paved the way for Margaret and Peter Townsend to marry if they still wished to do so.
A formula was found which would have meant that she could have retained her status as princess.
We now know that Princess Margaret, had she wanted to marry him, would have lost nothing but her place in the line of succession.
They really didn't want to create a martyr of Princess Margaret where her own personal desires were paired off against the establishment.
It was not government pressure that had ended the relationship between Margaret and Group Captain Townsend. The truth was far simpler.
Contained in the files released by the National Archives is a letter that Princess Margaret wrote in private and in secret to Anthony Eden. The crucial point of her letter was that she said, "It is only by seeing him that I can properly decide whether I want to marry him or not." The crunch is obviously that she had decided, and he also, no doubt, had decided that their love was no longer strong enough for them to marry.
If Elizabeth hoped her sister would find someone more suitable, she was to be disappointed.